Hey, friends, welcome back to the Brilliance of Humanity Summit. We have been having so much fun, so many great conversations. And friends, it's going to get a lot juicier because we're going to be talking all about intimacy. And to walk us and guide us through this conversation, we have got Mr. Shay Sun, who is from WABA International. Mr. Sun, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much, Deb. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Oh my gosh. And we need to let people know a little bit of the Mr. Sun, because of course you and I have known each other in some different
Yeah.
strategies, ways, all the things. And when I saw Mr. Sun, I was like, yeah, let's talk about the little teacher in you, right?
Yeah, actually, I was a classroom teacher for over, 20 years. And so I was known as Mr. Sun all that time. And so when I would put on my coaching hat, then I would take more of a Shay persona. But I'm realizing the fact that there are times where a little education, or in some cases, a lot of education. And so putting on my Mr. Sun hat is more of a persona for me to get into that mindset.
Oh my gosh, I am so all in. I love it. In fact, when I see your thing, Mr. Sun with your little sunshine, I'm like, this is so you. Like, this is a thing. And I love that you bring up persona, because we do have personas in the world, right?
Yeah,
All the
exactly.
time.
Yes, yes.
And what a perfect lead into intimacy, right? Because I do feel like there are so many conversations, but one of the things you and I talked about wanting to talk about is, why is the intimacy conversation important to humanity?
Yeah.
So let's sort of dive into, when we say intimacy, what are we really talking about? And then let's get into some key things that you have shared with me that are important for people to know.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So for me, intimacy really is about pair bonding. It's really about that close, honest, authentic connection. So when you think about like other words that would be the opposite, when you think of words like coercion, right? Or those types of words, when you think about a word like cohesion, right? Think about the difference in terms of energy. So for me, intimacy has this cohesion feel to it, where there's an authenticity in terms of what your desires are, where your wants are, what your needs are. Like all of that comes to this space. So there's a lot of honoring that happens in that intimacy space, where there's vulnerability, versus where when things are shallow. So like I love the words like in with WABA, like delve deeper, right? So sometimes when it comes to encounters between, especially like the opposite sex or romantic sense, that sometimes it could be very shallow and very surfacey. When you think in terms of like current hookup culture among young people, it's very transactional. And I'm not wired that way. I've never been that way. For me, really making connection is super important. So yes, there's that physical, like sexual intimacy, but then of course there's the emotional, psychological, and like spiritual even at times, right? Like all of that coming together. And so there's a really, I don't know, it's like you see, as I see you, you're seeing me, there's that feeling of feeling understood. But of course, we're using all of our bodies, all of our mind, and even the invisible parts of us.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And I'm curious about, what do you make up about why this has become such an issue in our society? You were mentioning the hookup culture, but there has to be other things getting in the way of this intimacy. This did just not start like 3 years ago.
No, this has been going historically. There's a lot of things throughout history that has caused this, even from like a hunter and gatherer, from that space. But I think the reason now it's becoming more of an issue is because we live in the information age. So I think there's just a lot more awareness and people sharing things more. But sometimes it's easy for us to get into this mindset that we are in the most unique time of human history. There are certain uniqueness deals with technology, but when it comes to some basic things like sexuality, right? Some of this is just conversations that we've had throughout human history. And I think part of the reason why is because it's like anything that's amazing and beautiful, it's easy for us to be able to then use that in a way that's not so beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I think when it comes to sex, into sexual intimacy, there's a lot of ways where humanity has not always been so generous and not so kind. And because of that, that's created a lot of shame. So because of that, we have this in our society, and I would say in a lot of societies, but especially with ours, we don't actually we're less comfortable talking about sex than having sex. And we promote sex through advertisement. We do a lot of that, but at the same time, we're really scared to really get vulnerable, even with our children talking, like when we're talking about the sex talk, or when teachers get to prepare to talk it in their science classes. Like we have, even in California where I'm at, there's California sex standards, but like people are really nervous about how to approach this. And especially now with the internet and so much access to any image out there, I think now it's even more important that this idea of like, what does mature sexuality look like? What does healthy, more well-balanced sexuality look like? Because when we want to really bond with someone long-term, and that becomes the foundation of human society, it's so important the fact that we actually break old cycles. Because if we don't break these old cycles, we're just going to continue to perpetuate them. And then we shouldn't be surprised when people have less satisfying relationships. So a lot of the reason why right now what's so cool in human history is because of brain science. A lot of the brain science that we learn, that we're discovering, has been such a powerful thing, especially when it comes to female sexuality, female pleasure. I mean, like in terms of like the clitoris, that's been a recent, in quotes, discovery, right? It's like 1492, we discovered the Americas, right? So I think,
well, you know, some women would probably say that was like discovering our America, right?
Exactly. So that's one of the reasons why now, if people are more open and willing to have a conversation about it, it actually allows us to feel more whole. It makes us to feel more complete, so that we don't feel like I don't know, there's something wrong with us. I think when people feel like there's something wrong with our basic self-worth, there's a lot of other things that come from it. Like if you experience too much shame, that shame, like in a lot of times with men, it just turns into rage. And you see that in society. I mean, like when you study it in war and things like that, like what's going on, some of this just needs, some of it is an educational thing. Some of it is like a Mr. Sun shining the light on something, right?
Yeah, it's so true. Oh my gosh. Yeah, you are shining the light on a lot right now. And I love it, love it, love it, love it. One thing that's fascinating me is here you were, you're this classroom teacher, and now we're talking about intimacy. I know you've had your own journey. What prompted you to want to study this conversation or really explore what was going on there?
So thank you for asking that question. I think a lot of it has to do with serendipity, synchronicity. Some of I think it has to deal with greater divine purpose, actually. Anyone who's known me in the past, I mean, I'm pretty authentic when it comes to sharing things. And I would talk about sex now and then, but it was never to this extent. I mean, I can share with you that if people, my friends would laugh. The friends who knew me when I went through my divorce, or even when I was going through separation, actually would almost snicker in the back of their head. Because when I moved out, I bought a twin-size bed. No single man who's getting divorced is going to buy a twin-size bed because the first thing they're going to think about is like, now I can have sex again. But I only use that as an example that for me, it wasn't this like, I'm free and now I can be with other women. That I was thinking my own health. Like I need to get something. So I bought a really crazy expensive twin-size bed that, you know, like took my heartbeat and like would elevate. So I was doing it for my own personal health. But what I discovered was that towards the end of my marriage, I wasn't sleeping in the same bedroom. And later on, I realized just how devastating that was into my own nervous system. Like, yes, we would have time to make love and things like that, but something was dissolving. And over the course of, you know, we did a lot of things well. But I think there was something to be said about sexual compatibility, that I was a lot more creative. I was a lot more like experimental and things like that. And even then I would read books on sex, like The Joy of Sex. You talk about joy, right? So Joy of Sex is one of the early books that I bought. And I would buy like DVDs and things like that on techniques or sensual massage and things like that. But I was always a little bit more. So after my divorce, so coming from a very conservative and almost traditional, like Confucius, almost Judeo-Christian in some ways, my worldview has expanded since then. But I just happened to have some opportunities to learn firsthand from people that were well-versed in Tantra and things like that. But it was all in a very safe way. And it was through that way that I discovered that, yes, sex is physical, but so much of sex is actually mental. It's your brain. It's about what does it mean to turn someone on. And so because I was an English teacher, and also because I'm, coactive coach, and so I do a lot of listening and reflecting and mirroring all of that, I was able to take a lot of those skills, combine them, put in my secret sauce, Asian fusion. And so I discovered the fact that women would have orgasms just by me speaking to them.
Wow.
So that's why I realized it was not just a physical thing. There's something going on in the mind. And then after my divorce, I had so many women, especially divorced women or women that were going through separation. They would be vulnerable with me. They would be honest with me and talk about like 10 years of no sex, or 6 years, or the sex was not satisfying. It was like one of those wham bam thank you ma'am thing.
Okay.
And that's where I realized there was a huge dichotomy between my own practice, even before my divorce, or after my divorce, like all of it, but it was just all enhanced. And so, and then when I started reading ancient, I was starting having conversations with my parents about this. And my dad told me about these ancient Chinese texts. And I went back to these texts that were lost for about 900 years. The Chinese texts were so harmonious. It was so yin and yang. It was so different from the history that I've seen in the West when we talk about sex. In the West, the way that people talk about sex is very extreme. Like even when it comes to, if you look at early church history, they talk about women being a temple above and a sewer below. I mean, just so like really degrading language. It's kind of like that whole thing about the two archetypes of the Madonna or the prostitute, the Mary Magdalene. It's very split. There needs to be a way of holding that space. So now I'm realizing more and more that healthy bonding sexuality for long-term relationships increases boosts your immune system. It helps you mentally, emotionally feel better, and increases your longevity. So that's why when it comes to like things that we have to, in quotes, go and purchase for our health, some of it actually is just two people that are intimate study buddies. They can actually empower each other so much more ways.
Wow. And my gosh, this is just, it's so fascinating. And there's so much here. Like we could do a whole series summit just on this, right? That might be your summit. That might be the one that you're doing. So I know when you and I were talking about prepping for this, you talked about really these 3 key points that we need to keep in mind when we are really honing in on this intimacy and how it applies to humanity. Let's go there. Let's start talking about those things.
Sounds good. So one of the things, let me start with the first 2. So according to Dr. Daniel Siegel, does brain, he's a neurobiologist. He says that the brain every few seconds is asking itself 2 questions. Am I safe and do I matter? And I remember when I was getting my master's degree in intercultural studies, one of my professors talked about in a counseling class. He says the 2 fundamental needs for human beings is security and significance, which actually falls into this safety and significance, right? So, or mattering. And so going back to like after I was divorced, I talked to a friend. We had a conversation. He was calling from Korea. And he said he wanted to give me a pointer because like I was single again. And he knew the fact that I had only been with my ex-wife, my wife, like, like I didn't have intercourse until my first night of my honeymoon. So think in terms of like how conservative this is, right? So he said to me, the most important thing when it comes to sex, and he's trying to like help me out, right? Here's my guy friend telling me, but he says the woman has to feel safe. Mm-hmm. She has to feel safe. If she's not safe, she will not open her heart. She will not open up her body. So when it comes to safety, this is not just a physical safety. This is an emotional safety. This is an environment safety. Like all of those things, it calms down the woman's nervous system so that way she can actually be excited and not inhibit herself. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that men often don't know is how much women think about physical safety. Like when they're walking on the street, like there's this like alert thing that goes on. And I did not realize this. And so because of that hypervigilance, because they're female, so think about it from a biological perspective. biologically, because men have a lot more testosterone than females, right? When even though we both have testosterone, estrogen in both males and females, but men have it more, it means that women don't have as much muscle mass, right? So when we look at sports, there's a big difference between women's sports and men's sports. So that means that men are, in quotes, faster and men are stronger. So when you get into a sexual encounter, the woman is really having to put a lot on the table in terms of what might happen to her. So when women talk about things like, I'm going on a blind date, or I met someone on Tinder, I'm going to call my girlfriend or my sibling and tell them, like, after so many times, I'm going to message you and tell you I am safe. Men don't understand that. Men don't think that way. So when it comes to safety, it is super important, especially when you're trying to do things that are more novel. If you're trying to include toys and put different positions, safety is super, super important. So am I safe? People hopefully will understand what that means, especially in the concept of Me Too and all that kind of stuff. And I'm realizing more and more and more that men, I'm going to say something maybe controversial, because I think sometimes when we talk about sexual shame, we think about the person who is the person who's been victimized, right? The person who's been assaulted. I think the fact that there ought to be sexual shame, but the sexual shame needs to lean into the space of the men. I think that there is a healthy, constructive shame, not the kind that debilitates us in terms of our self-worth, but that there is a that there's a healthy shame that's related to almost guilt, right? Because guilt is more of an action, shame is more of a person. I think that there ought to be an understanding that men ought to feel guilty in their conscience, right? That there's something that this is not right. Drugging women is not a manly thing to do. It's not a gentleman thing to do. It's not a humane thing to do. And I think that there has to be an expectation that so safety is important. I think we need to train young people to know that a person's body, a person's will, a person's choice, regardless of their, if you have access to them or not, if they're inebriated, it's off limits. You don't do that. So I'm going to get really personal. I hope this is okay, but I can tell you that I was with someone I was committed to, and she said, "Are you going to work?" Because I had never got drunk before. And like in my 40s, I've never been drunk, and so I wanted to know what kind of drunk I was, right? And she said to me, she says, "I want you to know it's okay to have sex with me," like, because she knew that I didn't want to have sex if anyone was inebriated. I can tell you that at one point, even after she was like, and I did have sex with her, I felt bad. Even though she gave me permission, I still felt bad, because there was this thing that I programmed in my brain, like it's important for the woman to, right? So do you see how this is like a building of that idea of, am I safe? Is she safe? Are we safe? So, and by the way, that was the first time I ever shared that publicly, but I wanted people to know that.
Glad you shared it here on the Brilliance of Humanity. Look at you shining in your brilliance.
Well, thank you. Well, because I do feel like that's a weird thing to share, because it wasn't an assault and it was an invitation. But even inside of me, I can see why it's not an okay thing to do. And there's so many stories out there. The other piece of significance, right? So am I safe is the physical, emotional, but do I matter? Mattering is more subjective than safety. I think mattering deals with value. It deals with, like, do I see you more than an object or a piece of meat? Do I see you as a human being? Do I see you as a spirit, a soul? And I think that there's where, when we say, do I matter in this relationship? Do I matter in this physical encounter? Do I matter while I'm performing this, act of service for you, right? This pleasurable service. Am I really here? There's almost of a mindfulness piece that goes into this idea of, do I matter? Because, Deb, for the longest time, even before I was a coach, before I was a teacher, women would tell me their stories. I remember being in college, and I was at a Christian college even, right? This is a long time ago. And I remember one of the first women that came to me, and I wasn't even super close to her. It was like late in the evening, and she came to me and told me she was assaulted on campus. And I remember how these women, and since then I've had so many women tell different degrees of assault, right? Like, and it doesn't even be in the United States. I get calls from like South America, from other places, telling me about when they go through things because they need someone to talk with. In each of these cases, the women feel like they do not matter. They don't use those words, but they feel they've been used. They don't feel like they're a human being. They feel like they were just something done to them. So that's the reason why the flip side of that, when you do feel like you matter, right? Thinking about orgasms and things like that, that's why the woman really lights up. So in terms of this, and again, I'm going to share something fairly personal, but the best compliment I've ever received from a woman is when they say, you can do whatever you want with my body. Because what that means is the fact that they felt so safe. They felt like they mattered so much. Now they're just saying, I trust you. And I trust that you have my best interests at heart as we're going through this, this intimate moment together. So mattering is really important. And even when it comes, especially when it comes to long-term relationships, like I just got my hair cut and I was talking to a woman who's been married for like 11 years. She's from a different country. And she's in an interracial marriage. And she even said that, yeah, we've been married for such a long time that, things start to fizzle. And you're talking about the 7-year itch and things like that people talk about. I honestly think, and I don't remember who it was who said this, but women have a hard time with monogamy. Women have a hard time with monogamy for a different reason. Women want monogamy because of the family, but women have a hard time with monogamy because they get bored in the bedroom. And that's why I started looking at my own life. And I was like, oh, I remember times where my wife wanted more romance, or she wanted more foreplay, or she wanted more whatever. And I'm like, oh, that's why. It's because women need excitement. They need something different. That's why women novels sell so well. Like when it comes to like erotic novels, is because again, it's a stimulation of the mind. So I think now understanding that, well, with knowledge, right? It's like awareness and agency, right? It's like knowing is half the battle type of thing. And so understanding that's really important. And the last one,
I got it just for just a minute here, because something just clicked to me when you were talking. And because we've been talking about this, like why this matters to humanity.
Yeah.
And there's sort of this, I almost feel like, do we need to double click on when the relationship is not satisfied and when there's not fulfillment and things start to break down? It doesn't just break down the unit. It does start to impact humanity, because if we have people who aren't, if people aren't fulfilled in one place, then they go take it out on somewhere else. So can we just make, I know we're going to get to the next one here, but like, can we just make a quick little tie into that?
Yeah, right. So everything begins with ourselves, right? And when we talk about personal agency, we're talking about our own self-talk. We're talking about our self-image. We talk about self-compassion. So what happens is when we don't actually have that cohesiveness within, it's really hard to offer that outside of ourselves. So it's that whole thing of like when people are angry, they kick the dog type of thing.
Yeah.
So what happens is when you don't have, when your bed is not a place of emotional safety where you're calming down the nervous system and then you're going back to work, either as a business owner or working for someone, and the world sometimes is not as patient and not as kind, and there's a lot of demands out there. But when your home then reinforces the fact that you are not safe and that you do not matter, then it's going to spill out somewhere. So I think this is where we're talking about like the brain, neurons that fire together, wire together. We're talking about neurotransmitters and hormones. When your system is constantly reinforcing that I am not safe and I don't matter, well, guess what? You're going to treat other people like they are not safe and they don't matter. So this is where we're talking about a ripple effect.
Yeah.
That's why understanding that when we are calming down nervous systems and we are more coherent within our own being. I mean, this is where people joke about like when you see your friend and you're like, oh my gosh, you just got some, or like you just had a really good night. They say that because there's something energetically that is coming out. Like it's when the birds are singing more beautiful, the sun is shining a little brighter, the songs are that much more, beautiful. I think there is something to be said that. And this is where that whole thing from the 70s that says make love, not war.
Yeah.
I really truly believe that if more people were fulfilled in their intimate bonding, I think the fact that it would have a massive effect everywhere. Teachers would be happier, which means that they're not going to be as grumpy with their students. Parents are not going to take things out on their kids when they spill things in the kitchen, right? Employees would have more grace from their employers. The White House might be a little bit nicer as well when there are foreign dignitaries in place. The dignitaries are going to be nicer as well. Overall, I think all of this would be more connected to our bodies, more connected to ourselves, and then also just more connected to our self-worth. That
Absolutely. And let's be clear, we're not just talking about sex here. We're talking about intimacy. Yes, that can be a physical intimacy, and also it's all of the things. And that's because that's the one thing I think sometimes we get confused about, right? Oh, well, I had sex last night. Well, okay.
Right.
I'm glad you're making some of these distinctions for people, because the intimacy conversation is so beyond just this one thing, right?
And part of it, I think, is because we're so centric on intercourse. I think we have to widen the lens to where any kind of intimate thing, like holding hands or eye gazing, like there's these moments, like sometimes things can be super erotic that's not even related to any sexual parts. But there might be something that we do, and like we have butterflies, or we have like the dopamine chills, is because something related, and we're like, ooh, like that felt there's some electricity that took place. That's right. So we have to look at, because other times people have said, like, I had a quickie that just meant nothing to me. Well, how is the fact that a quickie meant nothing, and yet like touching fingers in a moment when the sun was going down and the birds flew in the right moment, and suddenly there was this moment of awe and wonder, right? So
oh my gosh, it's so true. Okay, we better get to these other points, because there's just we could go on and on and on.
Yeah. So again, reviewing. So am I safe? Do I matter? That's really, really important. And then, of course, that's always, not just when it comes to intimacy. That's just everywhere in life. But when you add the third question, and the third question relates to pleasure. So if we're talking about safety, significance, and pleasure, then am I feeling pleasure? And am I feeling pleasure? There's two folds of this. And one, of course, is like, am I actually personally feeling pleasure? But then also there's a understanding of the fact that you want the other person to feel pleasure as well. So they're also asking themselves that question. And this is the reason why I think, typically now, the internet is where a lot of people are learning about sex education, but so much of that is entertainment, right? And also because some of those are purchased by men. So, and even the ones that are made by women, still, I think that there needs to be a more of a shift. And the reason for that is because when we're really talking about female pleasure, we really, really need to know in terms of what do we mean by that, because female pleasure is a lot about context. And because the context is so important. So one of the sexiest thing you can do for a woman in terms of context and like feeling pleasure is, like, you might want to do the dishes before you get to the bedroom, if all she's going to think about the dishes. Like, you might not know that the dishes were late, or maybe it's that one sock that's lit in the middle of the bedroom that didn't get picked up. Like, for some women, that could be the thing that's actually holding them back. So it's really important to understand what might be hindering that. So for a lot of like sexless marriages, the reason why sometimes the women are not prepared is because the fact that we think the fact that desire needs to come first, and it's actually not true. There's actually something that helps with desire, and that's arousal. So this is where, like, sometimes an example that Dr. Emily Nagoski, from her famous book "Come As You Are," or in her videos even, she says that, how you have those times when you don't want to go to a party. You're like, oh, I gotta get dressed, I gotta take a shower, I gotta do this and that. And then finally, when you get to the party, you're like, ooh, I'm so glad I came. Well, in the same way, when it comes to like setting aside time for intimacy, sometimes it's just actually getting into the mindset. And then through the arousal, then the desire then comes. And so sometimes it just really is about like just trusting and having faith that's going to come about. So, but again, when it comes to male and female, because the men are more, well, first of all, it's easier to satisfy men, even just from a time perspective. That's the reason why it's so important that the man is thinking about the woman, asking her the question, am I feeling pleasure? I think this is where the Taoist part comes in. In the Taoist text, it says that do not have intercourse until like you see these signs, like, you know, like cheeks being red and like pupils and like what, you know, what she's doing with her arms, her breath, like how the sounds that are coming out. Like you have to meet all of these conditions. It's like before you plant a seed in the ground, make sure you till the soil, make sure the fact that it's going to take. So I think part of it is that. So usually we use the term foreplay, but I think the fact that having the dichotomy between foreplay and intercourse actually does us disservice. I think instead just looking at it as a sexual encounter or intimate moment and widening that lens, because even if you don't, because older people, when you get older, for some people, especially when it comes to like men's bodies changing, there needs to be a redefining of what that means. Like even just laying in bed naked or cuddling, that might be enough. There's other ways of doing that. And so, and then for the men, you know, am I feeling pleasure? I think the biggest lesson that men ought to learn, well, actually, there's a couple of things. One is the fact that men often will overestimate when a woman is actually interested or ready. And that's a big problem. And the reason that's a big problem is because there's men who will get into an encounter and not realize the fact that it was sexual coercion. And maybe the woman was actually going into compliance, and that is not okay. That's one of those things where I think healthy shame needs to come in. And so I think that with men, there's another concept called that's called arousal non-concordance, which basically means that just because a body part is either wet or hard, it does not mean that you want to have sex. And the reason for that is because those biological functions is signaling to the brain that it's related to sex, but doesn't mean that you want it. So this is why communication, using our words, using our ears, especially our ears, matters, because that's where you can actually articulate what it is that's going on instead of having the other person just infer or blindly guess. Yeah.
Well, and what I love about what you just brought up there is, again, it's another tie into humanity. When we have those miscommunications, when we have, okay, what's really going on here? There's a lot. That could be an entire conversation that we would have about what happens when someone thinks that this is the signal you're giving, and in actuality, it's not, or when the body does something because I don't think a lot of people truly understand that, and then that gets in the way of humanity because people perceive it that you're somehow lying or you're this or that, right?
Yes.
And it just completely breaks everything down.
Yes, because then at that point, it's like you're being manipulative, you're being a tease. There's other things that come up. And then sometimes when it goes into rage, we know bad things happen to women. This is the reason why I think that when it comes to responsibility, women, of course, have their responsibility. That's a given because it takes two to tango. I also believe that men, just because they are stronger and faster, they need to take on more responsibility. I think there's something that one of the things that makes humanity, or what makes a civilization civil, is that those in power, with great power comes great responsibility. They understand that power comes with responsibility, that they have to watch and take care of the ones that are, in quotes, weaker, right? The ones who cannot speak up for themselves as easily. And because women typically go into fold or fawn and compliance or say things like, I'm sorry so much, it's super important that this is not just even what they say, but how they say it, and also their body language. Are they saying it with their eyes? Are they saying it with their bodies? Do you need to clarify those things or not? Like over clarify. Like, again, like when I was after my marriage with the person I was with, for the first 3 days, I asked all the time for everything. Until the third day, she's like, you don't need to ask so much. Like the asking was interfering with flow, because now she's like, I trust you. But I needed to hear that, so that way I wanted her to know your safety is that important. So, and then of course, when it comes to the pleasure piece for men, is just understanding this. And this is where I think that I don't know how many men understand this piece. Your greatest satisfaction in your most intimate times is when your woman is satisfied. Dr. John Gray said that he can boil down his practice of 20, 30 years, that when people come into his office for a divorce, the woman will say, I give and I give and I give and I get nothing in return. And the man will say, nothing I do makes her happy. Well, guess what? If you're a better lover in bed, she will be happy. And I give and I give and I give and I get nothing in return. Well, guess what? If you know that in the bedroom, because your women's skin is like 10 times more sensitive, and we know there are more nerves when it comes to the clitoral unit, especially the top, than the tip of a man's penis. I think that women will be like, you know what? I in quotes did all these nurturing responsibilities in my life, but wow, like he's really honoring my body. He's really seeing me. Like I think that this sex is that powerful. That the sexual experience is so amazing. That's the reason why when we talk about things like when the sex drive, that testosterone from that brain system, or talking about dopamine with that novelty and the romantic love, and we talk about the oxytocin and the serotonin that's created, right? The reward and the peace and all of these things that come together, like the afterglow and the cuddling, like it's a whole process that happens. And I think that if men understood, you got to not just think about that one moment of ejaculation or whatever, like that's, or even the word climax. I think maybe we need to like soften the word climax, because climax has this like very finishing line, like I'm running towards the finish line. I don't know if that actually serves us. I think it's better to think in terms of like a cuisine. Like we're enjoying the appetizer, we're enjoying the main meal, we're enjoying the dinner, we're enjoying the whatever afterwards, like the drink after, like all of it. I think if we could see it more as a whole perspective, I think women would feel more honored, and I think men would actually feel a lot more proud of themselves. I think men would feel like, oh my gosh, I really served, right? And I got something with it as well. So I think that's the reason why the difference between a mature lover and an immature lover is how much you think about the other person's safety, significance, and pleasure.
Oh, Mr. Sun, you are shining in your brilliance, as always.
Thanks.
I just want to say, I mean, my gosh, we could go on and on. We just want to be honoring of the time. And we do want to let people know, too, that as you continue to shine in that brilliance, there may be a little surprise when you get the email. As you know, we've been doing something special with each of our guests. And we're going to, are we calling this a little suspense, a little teasing? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Role playing. I'm not sure what we're doing here, but I think we're telling you, be on the lookout for some more sunshine from Mr. Sun. Shay, I just want to thank you so much for coming in. You are truly a thought leader. You have raised so many thought-provoking concepts. And one of the things I always like to say is there may be people watching that go, oh, I don't know about that. And we just invite, I think what you're saying is, I just invite you to consider this. I invite you to take a look. I invite you to really ponder. And the beautiful thing about putting a voice into the space is this is how we create new awareness and new thought processes. And truly, what I love so much about the intimacy mattering to humanity piece is there are so many things you brought up that matter on so many levels. Yeah. The conversations we're having, the intimacy, the way that we approach the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, like there's so much that branches from this conversation. So thank you so much for being a thought leader in this space. Thank you, Deb, for the invitation. Yeah, it's very honoring and I appreciate you. Yeah, I appreciate you. Oh my gosh. More to come. There's so much more to come. So thanks again to Mr. Shay Sun, Mr. Sun, and be on the lookout for that email, of course. And we just want to thank all of you for staying with us for the Brilliance of Humanity Summit. This has been so much fun, so much more to come, and just wishing you an incredible day, friends. Take good care.